I've heard many outstanding players that sit all the time. And for me, I find that standing is a very natural position, that you have a much more flexibility just for doing whatever you want to do. If you need to get in the upper register, you just take a little step back and turn a little bit, and you're right there. And if you need to play on the lower strings, you just kick it out with your knee a little bit, so you can adjust things as needed.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and as you heard from that opening quote from Max Dimoff, we are talking about standing versus sitting today. And I'll just say up front, this is not versus. I just wrote that so that you'll click on this. It is about standing, it's about sitting, and it's about posture in general on the bass. Another topic that I've covered extensively with guests. It's one of these topics that I thought, have I covered that before? Maybe once or twice. And then I went back in the archives and I realized, oh, wow, there are a lot of folks that I've talked with this about. And I'd like to give a shout out to Fred Zimmerman for recommending posture as a topic. I hope this is what you were looking for, Fred. And this is not Fred Zimmerman of the New York Philharmonic. This is another Fred Zimmerman. But thank you, Fred. You will be hearing, as you always do with these highlight episodes, from several voices. You'll be hearing from Randy Kertz, who is a specialist in musicians' health. He does the bass and the body column for the ISB. You'll also be hearing more from Max Dimoff, Cleveland Orchestra principal bassist and now University of Michigan bass professor. You'll be hearing from Alex Hanna, principal bass of the Chicago Symphony and DePaul University faculty member, Bruce Bransby of Indiana University, Greg Sarchet, longtime lyric opera player and Northeastern Illinois University bass teacher, wonderful guy, great player, very thoughtful musician, Michael Hovnanian, my primary bass teacher throughout my life, really, college, bachelor's and master's at Northeastern University. And Michael, of course, plays in the Chicago Symphony. You'll be hearing from David Grossman of the New York Philharmonic, Paul Ellison of Rice University, Ju-Fang Liu of the Indianapolis Symphony, Dennis Whittaker, principal bass of the Houston Grand Opera and bass teacher at the University of Houston, Szymon Marciniak, the wonderful solo bassist and chamber musician, formerly of the Hague Philharmonic, David Allen Moore of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and bass teacher at University of Southern California, and Ira Gold of the National Symphony and Peabody Conservatory. And I somehow managed to feature Ira in every single one of these highlight episodes. I think I have not yet put out one that didn't have Ira. So, 3 parts we're breaking this episode into. Part 1, unsurprisingly, sitting. Part 2, standing. And part 3, transitioning between the two. And there's much more to it than just that. And it's not only about sitting and standing, it's about posture in general. So many great takeaways in this episode. And we've got a couple of great sponsors for this episode, Upton Bass String Instrument Company and the Bass Violin Shop. More on them later. But let's dive into part 1, sitting. And we start off with a quote from Randy Kertz about the main differences between sitting and standing on your body.
The main differences between sitting and standing are going to be postural, in that are you leaning on something? Are you bending over in a certain way? You have to put your arm at a different angle perhaps when you're sitting and standing. And then you get into the variables such as, is the instrument the right size? What kind of stool do you have? Are your feet flat? There's a lot of different things that go into it, but essentially, the motions of playing the bass will change only to the degree that they need to be exaggerated or lessened according to your standing or sitting posture.
Alex Hanna describes how he used to stand all the time, and once he got to Curtis, he started sitting all the time. This is a common path for so many people, and it's great to hear Alex's thoughts on sitting in general and standing and some of the differences.
So in high school, I always stood, and then when I got to Curtis, I started sitting. And I sit for everything. I did a concerto with an orchestra in July, and I kind of toyed with the idea of standing, just because when you stand, I just feel so much more free. Mm-hmm. You know, when you sit, when I sit, I feel very locked in. and like I can't really move. There's not much. Your feet pretty much have to go one place. So I don't like that about sitting, but I love the fact that you're completely in control of the instrument. So I sit for everything. I've been using a yoga block for my left leg. Not so much that I don't like having the rung of the stool support my foot, but I like that I can move where my leg goes with the block. So it's nice to have that freedom. Andy Rossetti was really nice and loaned me a bent end pin, the egg pin thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a work in progress for me. I'm not sure if that's something that I will explore or not. But at first, I can tell you, I was like really turned off. I was like, "What is this?" The bass is like flying to the other corner of the room, but Andy and so many other players seem to really have a great balance with that. So I want to figure that out.
That locked in feeling that Alex is talking about when you're sitting, that's something that comes up again and again in this episode. So hone in on that description. And we're going to go over to Bruce Bransby, and he talks about why he likes sitting for orchestra.
I always practice standing up. If I play a solo, I play standing up, but I never stand if I'm playing an orchestra. An example of someone who does both. I mean, I could stand up playing an orchestra. It just doesn't make sense for me.
Right. Sure.
I like to be able to plank myself where I can see the conductor and the music at the same time. And if one person's standing, the other person is sitting, where does the stand go? How high, how low?
And that's definitely a common frustration in orchestra if you have radically different heights for players, and especially if somebody's standing and then someone's sitting real low, that can be a challenge for sure. You're getting bowed in the eye if you're sitting low and you're bowing that person's knee. We've probably all been there. I've certainly been there. Another concept in terms of sitting that several people have talked about and that I've worked with and struggled with and have come to different solutions in terms of is recommending to my students whether they should sit or stand. These days, I don't recommend either. I work with people where they're coming from. But I've got this great quote from Greg Sarchet, and we're chatting with another bass player, a former student of his named Hans Peterman, in a Bosnian pizza place in Chicago, which is the best possible place to do a podcast. That was a lot of fun. So here's Greg and Hans on the topic of sitting.
Do you start people sitting on a stool or standing, or is that something you leave up to the personal?
I don't know. What would you say about that, Hans? I think you're pretty insistent on the sitting.
You're pretty insistent.
At least you're insistent on the negative aspects of playing while standing. That's the way I would put it. Based on my limited experience of whatever years I've been teaching, a solid 15, if not more, I find that people learn better or easier or quicker. Better would not be the word, but it seems like progress is more evident when they're seated.
Why do you think that is? Just out of curiosity, is it a left-hand thing?
Yeah, left hand. You don't have to clutch. It's easier to let go of this compulsion to grab onto the neck and to learn how to, as I guess Eugene Levinson would say, hang like a monkey in a tree on the neck. Right? So letting your natural gravity work for you. The same thing could be said for standing about natural gravity, but I just find people clutch and develop a lot of habits that are hard to unravel.
In terms of sitting for students, Michael Hovnanian and I had a similar conversation. Here's an excerpt from that conversation.
Do you advocate standing or sitting for students most of the time? Most of the time sitting. I mean, just because that's what I've always done. Although I've been goofing around a little bit with standing up and playing just on my own. But I just for the left hand, at least it's for beginner students. I've seen so many problems with them trying to hold up the bass and just dealing with that whole thing that it's almost like just try and get something that's stable somewhere.
And like many people, David Grossman of the New York Philharmonic, who's also a heck of a jazz player, by the way, David stands when he plays jazz and sits when he plays orchestra. David and I are chatting with John Grella, who's been my co-host for so many of these episodes.
When I'm playing jazz, I stand, but I'll tell you, for playing solos and in the orchestra, I'm much more comfortable sitting.
Now, when you made that switch, did that make a big difference with you with your tone, with just working on bow stuff? Some of my students, I always see that's kind of real big sometimes. Just as the bass gets sort of firm and it sort of frees up, the balance situation.
For me, it was instantaneous. I mean, I felt not only was my sound like twice as big, not that it was huge before. I mean, this is something I needed to address, but it much improved, and I just felt more comfortable, especially in the upper positions on the bass. I felt like, okay, now even though there's some uncharted territory up there, now I'm stable enough. I can get at it. And it's funny because I have had over the years a number of students who are much more comfortable standing and than sitting, and so I guess it's just personal. But for me, it was no question much more comfortable to sit.
That's part one, all about sitting. For part two, we're getting into standing and some of the key differences. And I'd like to give a shout out to Upton Bass and let you know about their Bohemian bass, which is the simple gamba outline that they started with, and it got a complete overhaul back in 2012 when they moved into the barn where they're currently at. Beautiful facility up in Mystic, Connecticut. Now, Upton had one of the best looking Ju-Facts that they'd ever seen. It was the epitome to them of a Bohemian styled bass, what that should be. And it was so close to their simple gamba style, but it was much more elegant, so they had to copy it. And everything about the Upton Bohemian bass is meant to fit in. It's as close to what a 3/4 size bass should be in the marketplace today. It's not too big, not too small. It's what they call the Goldilocks bass. It's just right. And you can check it out at uptonbass.com. And we have a link in the show notes for the Bohemian model. Now, part two, we're diving into standing. And we'll preface this with a quote from Paul Ellison about bass shapes and what an effect they have on the player. It's a good thing to think about when we're talking about the topic of posture.
The bases should have been developed to fit the human body. And in some cases they were. And in some cases they weren't. So we still have to evaluate what's the most, we don't get extra points for the difficulty of what we do. It's not the Olympics. You only get judged for the quality of your sound and the quality of the music you make. So to be able to be successful has a great deal to do with the accessibility of the gear that you choose and the setup that it has, and its ability or your ability to be able to interact with either the bow or that instrument. So yes, to answer your question, sorry I gave you a very long-winded answer.
No, that's great.
But it's extremely important. It was interesting in the early days of working with Francois. He hadn't done any teaching really before me. I was the number one student and also the guinea pig for the third book. But he is still fond of saying, and will say so on a regular basis when he's talking with teachers in a teacher workshop, the most important basses and bows are those that are used by children. They need the best setup, they need the best strings and the best balanced bows. This is where the future is coming from. This is where habits are established. And we're getting closer to that in today's world, but we've still got a long way to go with that kind of a mindset.
Bass shape is a major consideration, and frankly, height. Listen to this clip, very short clip, but to the point, from Ju-Fang Liu of the Indianapolis Symphony.
I do mostly standing because I'm not tall.
Okay.
And even though I'm considered big in Asian people size-wise, but I still consider small. So sitting down with a big bass in front of me it feels really strange. So I predominantly stand when I play.
In part one, you heard Alex Hanna's journey from standing in high school to sitting down and predominantly sitting. Now, very common journey. That was exactly what happened to me. Standing, started sitting, never stood up again until about 12, 13 years ago. I started to experiment with standing. So we're starting to talk about standing in this segment, and we're going to play a clip from Max Dimoff, who went from sitting all the time to standing. Here are his experiences with that transition.
So you stand all the time too, right? Practicing in the orchestra and everything?
And, actually, that came out of Gary Carr as well from that summer in 1985. I'd been sitting for about 3 years up to that point, and I was sure that was the best way to do it for me. And I had a pretty good, comfortable sitting position. I was watching Gary play every day, and I started thinking, it's kind of interesting what he's doing over there. And so I tried standing one day, and the next day I tried to sit down on my stool. And he said, no, you can't do that. Now that you've tried it, you have to keep doing it the rest of the time. And I was thinking to myself, you got to be kidding me. and so I gave it a try, and I did what he said. And, I figured he was my teacher, for those 3 weeks. And why am I there if I'm not going to do what he tells me to do? And I'll give anything a try. And so I tried it. And the whole time thinking, okay, as soon as I get back home, I'm going to sit again. And I did. I sat down again, and then the bass just felt like it had a huge mute on it, and I was getting no sound whatsoever. And then I stood up, and it finally opened up, and I realized that the back of my knee was hitting the bass, and hitting the back of the bass. And then I remember thinking, well, I guess I just have to stand. And rather than trying to adjust my sitting position or change my stool or anything, I'd gotten rather comfortable doing it. Now I actually, anybody who sits, that's fine. There's a lot of most players sit, and in the orchestra it's very practical. And I've heard many outstanding players that sit all the time. And for me, I find that standing is a very natural position that you have a much more flexibility just for doing whatever you want to do. If you need to get in the upper register, you just take a little step back and turn a little bit, and you're right there. And if you need to play on the lower strings, you just kick it out with your knee a little bit, so you can adjust things as needed. It's rather than being. I find with sitting, it's a fixed sort of locked position. That now that I stand all the time, I didn't feel that at the time, but I think for me, I think it's much easier to stand. And the older I get, I come home with sore feet sometimes after concerts, but I get really good shoes.
And that's not the only time I've heard that shoes comment. I remember my dad telling me most important investment you can make is a pair of really good shoes when you're in a job where you're on your feet. And if you're standing and playing bass, that's the case for sure. And Dennis Whittaker of the Houston Grand Opera and University of Houston, he talks about this as well. And he has a fascinating excerpt that I'm going to play here just about the whole experience of playing in an opera orchestra standing the whole time. Think about the hours that involve standing on your feet. Here's why he does it, and here's why he made that transition from stool to standing.
What have you found freeing about standing that sitting was sort of like causing challenges for you?
There's a number of challenges. First of all, in our pit, space is very limited. So the benefits of not having a stool in a very tight, closed space, first of all, is very good because it creates more space for everybody. Second, for me, is the bass. I have this very large English bass that is shaped a lot like Ed Barker's bass. It's an unnamed English bass that was owned by a man named Dick Topper in the Cincinnati Orchestra. And a long ways before him, it was actually owned by an English freelancer named Bruce B. Mollison, who was the principal bass player on the Empire Strikes Back soundtrack. So I like calling this my Star Wars bass. But it's got these gigantic shoulders, and finding a stool where I can get around on top of the bass like I need to is not very easy. I've got my metal stool with the round rungs on it, the drafting stool, and a classical guitar footrest for when I really have to stabilize the bass. And that's for power playing. So I like playing Beethoven 5 sitting down because the bass is really locked against my body. But in opera, that setup, I can't hold that tight, tense setup for 3 or 4 hours because it locks my hips into place, it locks my legs into place. I don't have that free swaying motion that gives me a lot of energy recovery when I play. The opera owns some stools, but the distance between the seat and the rung is fixed. So you can raise the stool, but the leg comes up with it. So then what that does is it locks my left leg into a tight angle that's uncomfortable. And that's not comfortable for 3 hours either. So I think it's liberating to me, and I don't mind standing. But I've also done it for, I think I started standing about 15 years ago consistently. And so I've learned over 10 or 15 years how to stand and how to play it and how to be comfortable and how to get endurance out of it. And with the Houston Grand Opera too, we do such a variety of styles where it's not always about power. It's rarely about power. We're doing Electra next year. That's going to be about power. And that one, and it's an hour and a half. So I may sit for that one because it's a very short opera and it's very strong and it's a lot of playing. So I'm thinking now that I will sit for it. But for the longer ones, when I stand for a long time, it's better on my back. I've tried sitting, and after about an hour and a half, I'll stand up from the stool. My back will pop, and the hips will be a little locked in place, and I just have to readjust, and I don't like that. The real trick for me on the English bass was essentially learning how to use my hips, learning how to use the contact point of the bass against my hip and belly once I could learn to put the neck on my shoulder by throwing my hips back instead of leaning into the bass. That was the game changer for me. And that was one of the big epiphanies in my own practice, was learning how to, when I bent my knees, the bass came on my shoulder. So that's another thing. When I sit down, in order for me to get that contact point of the neck on my shoulder, I have to lean forward. And that's a much different feeling on my back.
So Dennis uses the Laborie style end pin, and we're going to cover that a bit here on the podcast. A lot of people who stand use a Laborie style end pin. If you're not familiar with what that is, that's the end pin where there's a second hole drilled near the back of the bass, just behind the regular end pin hole. And it's put in at an angle, and that angle is a little bit different for every player. And there are lots of other types of angled end pins out there that people are using. Emilio Guarino, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, has a new end pin called the chromatic end pin that I've been using. It's my first time experimenting with an angled end pin, and that actually goes in the regular end pin socket. And I've really been enjoying the shift in weight. Very interesting. And then Rob Anzalotti of Bass Capos has come out with a different design that's also an angled end pin that fits into the regular socket. So if you're looking to experiment with this and you're a little cautious about drilling into your bass, there are some options out there, and I'll link to both of these. Szymon Marciniak has been playing with the Laborie end pin for quite some time, and here are his experiences on what that's done for his playing.
Obviously, it's not that it completely changes your playing immediately. It comes step by step. One of the most funny thing that I found out that because of using this end pin, because I use it on my bass, but you have to drill a hole. So 90% basses you find, other basses that you play with, if I'm using for other gigs or projects or playing in orchestra, they will have just a normal straight end pin. So you still have to play on them in a way like you used before. But having the experience with the Laborie end pin actually changed my approach to the straight one too, in some ways. I just find that some things are physically easier with that angle. Well, first of all, because the bass is put in a more sort of friendly angle to your, or maybe physically natural angle to your bow arm. And I think still it doesn't matter if you play the underhand or overhand bow. It's just more natural weight on the strings without overusing any muscular force. It's just very natural for your back, getting to a high register of the instrument, and also it opens actually sound of the instrument. And because by putting the hole, which is not in the center of the instrument but on the back, you change the gravity. You move the center of gravity of the instrument, so it becomes actually, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to hold an instrument with.
I have, but I've never done more than like 10, 15 minutes of playing on one. So I haven't really sunk into that setup.
But have you ever, that's good. If you ever had a chance to compare the same bass, putting a straight end pin and then playing the same bass right after that with the Laborie end pin, you would probably realize that the bass gets strangely light.
Okay.
It's almost swinging or swimming. Like it's very difficult actually to balance in the beginning when you're not used to, because the bass sort of escapes from you.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed with when people come and I try someone's bass. I always worried I'm going to drop it on the ground.
That's right. So that's the strange thing. That's why it's actually not so easy. And I think even Francois said that you should start, if you've never done it, you should start by 10 minutes per day. I actually played, when I bought my Kenwala, I first used a very normal straight end pin, but then I was using for a year at least, I was using the bent end pin, but the steel end pin just put into the pack. But then in this 45 degrees angle, which was a kind of you could say a bridge for me between coming from a very straight end pin to the Laborie end pin. So I had kind of a bit of the feeling of how it feels already. So when I started with using the Rabat end pin, I didn't actually switch back between straight and, because the difference was just too big.
All right, we covered sitting in part 1, standing in part 2, and in part 3, we're talking about making that switch, specifically from sitting to standing. Some great takeaways. And I'd like to thank our other sponsor for this episode, the Bass Violin Shop, which offers the Southeast's largest selection of basses. And here's what Scott Gentry has to say about his experience with the Bass Violin Shop. Scott says, the Bass Violin Shop is top-notch. Bob and the entire staff are friendly, professional, and skilled at what they do. A neck issue with my 54K made it virtually unplayable. In a matter of a few days, my bass was ready and it plays like a dream. Fast, friendly service, and reasonably priced. I couldn't be more satisfied. Thanks, Bass Violin Shop, for the awesome service you provide. And if you'd like to read more reviews of the Bass Violin Shop, you can check out their website, bassviolinshop.com, or check out their Facebook page, and we've got that linked up in the show notes. Okay, we're starting off part 3 with a short quote from David Allen Moore about when he transitioned to standing full-time in the LA Philharmonic.
You know, as time has gone on, I had installed a Laborie N10 on my Galliano just for the sound and comfort factor in the orchestra. But this past year, I went to standing full-time in the orchestra.
Oh, wow.
So that's been great. I can't be more happy about that. The stagehands are thrilled as well because they don't have to lug my stool around.
By the way, that's a quote from my first interview with David, which was 10 years ago at this point. So he's been standing for quite some time in the LA Phil. And I've got a final couple of quotes, both from Ira Gold, to round out this episode. And Ira has a wonderful description of what the experience of standing in the orchestra has been like for him, why he made that change, and how it's changed everything for him, the experience of the music and that sort of thing. And we're going to start with a short quote. This is from my very first interview with Ira. It's kind of the cool thing about doing this for a while. So this is from 10 years back when Ira was kind of contemplating the idea of standing.
I did start standing when I started playing, when I first began when I was 12, and I started sitting, probably a year or two after that, and I've been sitting ever since. I do want to explore standing at some point.
So like I said, the topic of standing came up in our more recent interview as one of the key topics that we talked about. So I'm going to play this out, and it's just a wonderful perspective on how something like that, a change in your posture, a change in the way you approach the instrument, can change so many things about your music making.
More recently, over the last couple of years, I've been standing full-time with the orchestra job and everything else. So the running seems to have supported some of the strength that I need to stand up all the time.
Yeah, sure. What prompted that switch to full-time standing?
I think it just kind of hit me. I mean, the actual situation that occurred was I went to New York for a couple weeks to play with the East Coast Chamber Orchestra, and I did not want to bring my stool with me because I didn't want to take it all over New York. So we just had a lot of concerts in different places, and I think we even did some shows in Massachusetts and in Philadelphia, and I knew that I was going to take the train there. And so it sort of started as, well, I'm just not going to bring my stool, and I had already had both of my basses drilled with the Laborie N10 style, and I had been doing that for like solos and chamber music, and and teaching. Just like whenever I felt like it, I would stand up, mostly practicing. But when I would go to the orchestra, I would just always sit down because that's kind of mostly what most people do. So it sort of was like, okay, I'm going to go to New York for 2 weeks. I'm not going to bring the stool. I'm going to stand up and play all these rehearsals and concerts. And as I was going through that process, it just kind of got me thinking about, well, maybe I should continue this. So when I got back to Washington, I decided that I was not going to necessarily switch full time, but I was just going to keep exploring it. So I just said, all right, let's just keep standing for a week, for a month, for a couple months. Let's just see where this goes. And basically after 3, 4, 5, 6 months, by the time it kind of reached the point where I had been aware that it had been a while, I was just kind of like, all right, this is the new normal. So that was about 2 years ago.
You know, you've got these long concerts. Do you feel it after at the end of a long Mahler symphony, for example, or something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because we actually played, I think it was Mahler 3 recently in the fall, and the only people that were standing up in the orchestra for the whole concert, I think it was about 90 minutes, were me and Maestro Eschenbach. And I sort of looked around the orchestra, and like sometime during the middle of the concert, it just sort of dawned on me like, okay, Christoph and I are the ones that we're standing up for this whole show, you know, and I don't know, he's 76 or 77 and he's doing it. And so granted, you know, what's the difference between playing a bass versus waving your arms? I mean, conducting is very physical. So, yeah, I mean, I think there are times when I feel my legs fatigued, and, you know, you can feel that there's a difference between being in pain and being tired or being fatigued. And I rarely feel pain. I do enough stretching and yoga and, you know, just making sure that I drink enough fluids and, you know, just moving around, even when you're playing, whatever the context is, as long as you're shifting your weight and letting blood flow and air move through your body, then you can theoretically stand up for a long time. The problem that I think people have is that they associate standing with being on your feet and not moving. And I think the key is to continue to shift your weight around on all parts of your feet and shifting your weight even forwards and backwards and not getting stuck in any one locked position, like, for example, with your knees, keeping your low back nice and loose and having just that natural curve. So all of those things can, I think, help actually strengthen the experience rather than feeling like, oh, I hope I get through this. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the first few months to a year that I went through it, you know, it was just kind of taking inventory in your mind of what's going on in a concert and what do you notice as the week goes on, certain moments in a piece or throughout the day where you feel more or less of your body trying to tell you something about what's going on, and just try to listen to it as much as possible and then do something with it. I think a lot of people, they just like experience something that they don't like, discomfort, and then they just kind of go, well, I hope that gets better, rather than it being information that is prompting you to change something. You know, like, I think pain usually is your body's way of talking to you about something that you're not doing. It is something the body doesn't like. So that's why I try to stay in touch with that, and that helps me to, you know, have the best experience I can have.
Now, why might someone want to consider standing full-time or standing more or even standing at all? Having thought about this, you probably got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the way I was sitting for years was completely designed around the idea of having my legs free and bent to be a part of the experience of playing. So, you know, if you're sitting on a high stool and your legs are very straight, it basically takes your whole lower body out of it, and then it like stiffens your low back and your spine. And then anytime you've got to go to the G string, you have to twist your spine in order to get over there. So the whole experience of sitting, even when you're sitting low and you've got a lot more mobility, there's still the seat that's kind of preventing some freedom of motion. So standing kind of just opens up that whole restriction and kind of allows you to basically do whatever you want and not have to adjust your posture in order to get what you're looking for. So if you're playing on the low string and you're drawing a sound and then you need to go up and play some high note on the G string, you don't have to. When you're sitting on the stool, your body is pretty much where it's going to be, and then your arms have to reach more. Even if you fold nicely from your hips, there's still some reaching in your upper body to get to that note. But if you're standing, you can literally step forward and around, and the bass can move forward, and you can change the angle of how the fingerboard is in relation to the wall or the ceiling, and you can make all of those changes just by stepping back and around, or shifting your weight to the right. And so you can do a lot more with getting around the instrument and it not affecting your body at all. So that was kind of an immediate thing I noticed. Any kind of low back tightness or stiffness or anything that I experienced in the years of sitting has all disappeared. It's pretty much non-existent now. So that's a big thing that's really helped. I think the biggest obstacle in playing in the orchestra is that anything that's on the low string, particularly on the extension, if you have anything that's fast, the bass moves around a lot more when you're standing with the bent end pin, even though the balance of the instrument is really nice when it falls into your body. When you're playing on the low string, or really when you're playing anything fast or loud or anything that involves strokes, the bass moves a lot more, because when you're sitting, you can rest it up against your left knee and it keeps it more stable. So, I remember the first few months working on things and noticing how much the bass moved, and really trying to tell myself, don't react to this, don't get upset or be frustrated about the fact that the bass is doing something different than what you're used to. Just accept that truth and work with it. So now I don't even think I'm even aware of how much the bass moves or doesn't move, because I use that movement to help me do whatever it is I need to do. So if you're doing a staccato or something on the D string, if you videotaped it and you watch the instrument, it kind of wobbles just a tiny bit. You can see the instrument just shaking a tad, but you try to keep it as neutral and as minimal as possible, sort of as it was when you were sitting. So yeah, there's challenges. Stuff on the low part of the instrument can be tricky, and trying to get the weight into the string while you're trying to power something loud and fast, the lower register of the instrument, and balancing the bass while it's moving around, all that stuff. When all those things are countering together, it can, it doesn't always work in exactly the way that you're wanting to get. So that's been a challenge. I don't feel like I've figured it all out, but I've given myself up to the whole experience. I remember when I wrote to David Moore about this and said, I'm doing this because he's somebody who's been doing this for a long time. He said at that point he'd been doing it for eight and a half years. So he's over 10 years now, and I'm only 2 years into this. So I think there's a lot more to learn about it, in the coming years. And I'm glad that I decided to do it now at this point in my career, so I have some time to play repertoire again. In a way, playing the same pieces standing almost feels like you're playing it for the first time, because your experience with the instrument is totally different. So, you can play Beethoven 5, 8 times over a decade sitting down, and then all of a sudden you play it standing up with the orchestra, and it's different. So that's been fun to see what I learned from that experience.
That is going to wrap up this episode. I hope you found this interesting. I love deep diving into these specific topics and going back and finding what past guests have talked about. I get a lot out of it. And obviously there's no right answer, right? Standing, sitting, Labrie end pin, angled end pin, straight end pin. People find different ways to work with this instrument, like Paul Ellison talked about, and Ru Fong in those excerpts. bass shape plays a factor. Your size as a player plays a factor. The way you like to approach the instrument plays a factor. There's so many factors at play, but I find it so useful to hear these different perspectives, and it really makes me think. And I'm an experimenter. I like to experiment. I try angled end pins, I try straight end pins, I sit, I stand, I change my end pin height, and I find that experimentation valuable. I don't do it all the time or go insane, but I get a lot out of that, and it's great to hear these diverse ways that we all approach the instrument. I hope you enjoyed this highlight episode, and if you want to check out other greatest hits of the podcast, contrabassconversations.com/highlights has all of these that I've put together and will put together. So you can learn about auditioning. That was a big topic. Put together 4 podcasts on that. And then Winning the Audition, the book. You can learn more about practice routines, fitness in the bass, jazz masters giving advice on the business of jazz, and others as well. What did I just do? I did the bow strokes one. And I have another 20, 30 ideas that I could easily pull out from the podcast and plan on pulling out on a regular basis. But what's most helpful is if I hear from you about what you think would be cool, whether it's something from past episodes like this or some sort of specific topic. Let me know what you'd like me to cover. That's where I get all my ideas these days. That's how I got this idea from Fred Zimmerman. Thank you again, Fred. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on where you'd like this podcast, your podcast, to go. So reach out, feedback@contrabassconversations.com, and please share this episode with someone that would benefit from it. Share it with a student, share it with a colleague, share it with your mom if your mom is interested in these topics. Whatever you could do to help spread the word about this show, I would be so grateful. And all these people that you heard today, I'm sure would appreciate it. That's going to do it for another episode, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.